In a suburban colonial house in Millbrook, a broken social worker was about to face the family that had rewritten her existence. What started as a hopeful Thanksgiving homecoming took a shocking turn when she came face to face with a sister whose smile could destroy souls. Sarah Morrison wasn't your typical victim. For 3 years, she had spent her life helping families escape psychological manipulation, known for her ability to recognize gaslighting patterns that others missed. When she encountered Claire's calculated greeting, "All right, you still think you belong here," she had no idea she was walking into a carefully orchestrated campaign to erase her from family memory. Sarah's determination to reclaim her truth would lead to exposing decades of systematic abuse. What began as a desperate attempt at reconciliation would become a psychological war for reality itself. The Morrison family would never be the same after Sarah chose to fight for her sanity rather than accept comfortable lies. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra, special for you. The exit sign for Millbrook appeared through the November drizzle like a ghost from Sarah's past. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel as muscle memory guided her Honda through streets she'd once known by heart. 2 years. It felt like a lifetime. Yet the familiar landmarks triggered a flood of memories that made her chest tighten with each passing block. The old water tower still bore the faded remnants of graduation year graffiti. The corner pharmacy where she'd bought her first pregnancy test, negative, thankfully, at 17. The high school where Claire had been valedictorian while Sarah had been quietly proud of her B average. Everything looked smaller somehow, as if her absence had shrunk the world she'd once thought was everything. She'd rehearsed this moment countless times during the 6-hour drive from Denver. The explanations she'd give, the apologies she might offer, the careful words that would bridge the chasm that had opened between her and her family. But now, turning onto Maple Street, her mind went blank except for the steady mantra she'd been repeating for miles. They invited me. Mom said they wanted me here. The colonial house at 247 Maple Street looked exactly the same. White shutters freshly painted, the wraparound porch her father had built the summer she turned 10, the oak tree where she'd once hidden a time capsule with Claire. The perfection of it made her stomach lurch, everything preserved exactly as it had been, as if her departure had been seamlessly erased. Sarah sat in her car for a long moment, engine ticking as it cooled. Through the bay window, she could see the warm glow of the living room, shadows moving behind sheer curtains, her family going about their lives in the space where she'd once belonged. The front door opened before she'd even reached the porch steps. "Well, well," Claire's voice carried across the distance, honey-sweet with an edge that made Sarah's skin crawl. "Look who decided to grace us with her presence." Her sister stood framed in the doorway like a magazine portrait, blonde hair perfectly styled, wearing the kind of effortless designer sweater that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly therapy bills. At 34, Claire had only grown more beautiful, more polished, more intimidating. "Hi, Claire." Sarah's voice came out smaller than she'd intended. "Thanks for... Oh, right." Claire's smile was radiant and cold. "You still think you belong here?" The words hit like a physical blow. Sarah stopped halfway up the porch steps, her overnight bag suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. "Sarah!" their mother's voice called from inside, artificially bright. "Is that you, honey?" Claire stepped aside with an exaggerated flourish, her smile never wavering. "Come on in, little sister. We've got so much catching up to do." The bowl house smelled the same, Linda's vanilla candles mixed with the faint scent of her father's coffee. But something felt wrong the moment Sarah crossed the threshold. The family photos lining the hallway seemed rearranged, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly how. Her eyes searched for her own face among the frames and found it oddly absent from the most prominent displays. "Sarah!" Linda Morrison rushed from the kitchen, arms outstretched, but her embrace felt stiff, performative. "Oh, sweetheart, you... Look." She pulled back, studying Sarah's face with the kind of worried assessment usually reserved for the sick. "Are you eating enough? You look thin." "I'm fine, Mom." Sarah managed a smile. "Good, actually. Work's been... work." Claire's laugh tinkled like broken glass. Tell me, are you still playing social worker? Or have you moved on to your next savior complex? Claire. Bob Morrison's voice carried a warning as he emerged from his study, though it lacked any real authority. He'd aged in the 2 years since Sarah had seen him. More gray at the temples, new lines around his eyes. His hug was brief, distracted. Good to see you, kiddo. The casual dismissal in his tone made her throat tight. This was her father, who used to read her bedtime stories and teach her to change the oil in her car. Now he looked at her like she was a distant relative whose name he couldn't quite remember. Where's Tyler? Sarah asked, desperate to change the subject. Upstairs, doing homework. Claire's tone suggested this was somehow Sarah's fault. You know how teenagers are, antisocial. But Sarah caught movement on the staircase, a flash of dark hair, eyes that met hers for just a moment before disappearing. Tyler. He'd grown tall, all angles and awkwardness, but those eyes held an intelligence that reminded her painfully of Claire at that age. Dinner was a carefully orchestrated performance. Linda had made all of Sarah's childhood favorites: pot roast, mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, but the conversation felt like navigating a minefield. Every topic seemed loaded with hidden meanings and revised histories. Remember when Sarah ran away to Aunt Diane's that summer? Claire said, cutting her meat with surgical precision. Such drama over nothing. Sarah's fork paused halfway, to her mouth. I didn't run away. I asked to visit Diane because you were angry that Mom and Dad wouldn't let you quit piano lessons, Claire finished smoothly. You always were dramatic about discipline. But that wasn't right. Sarah had asked to visit Diane because Claire had convinced their parents that Sarah was lying about practicing, had made them believe Sarah was sneaking out when she was actually at the library. She'd been 14 and desperate to escape Claire's constant undermining. I don't remember it that way, Sarah said carefully. Linda's laugh was nervous. Oh, honey, you were so young. Claire's memory is probably better. She was older. The casual dismissal felt like a slap. Sarah looked around the table, searching for any sign that someone else remembered things differently. Bob was studying his plate. Tyler was cutting his meat into tiny, precise pieces. Only Claire met her eyes, and her smile was triumphant. The evening continued in the same vein. Every shared memory had been subtly rewritten, every story carefully edited to cast Sarah as difficult, unstable, or simply wrong. When Sarah mentioned her work helping families in crisis, Claire sighed dramatically. Still trying to fix everyone else's problems instead of dealing with your own. When Sarah brought up her therapist's suggestion that she reconnect with family, Linda's face went tight with worry. Therapist? Oh, Sarah, is everything okay? The concern in her mother's voice sounded genuine, but underneath it was something else. Fear. As if Sarah's mental health was a ticking bomb that might explode and damage the careful peace they'd built in her absence. By 9 o'clock, Sarah felt like she was drowning. Every breath felt labored, every word carefully monitored. She excused herself to use the bathroom and found herself staring at her reflection in the mirror above the sink. The same mirror where she'd practiced prom makeup with Claire, where they'd whispered secrets and planned their futures. The girl, in those memories, felt like a stranger now. I should probably head to bed, she announced when she returned to the living room. Long drive. Of course. Linda's relief was barely concealed. Your room is all ready for you. But when Sarah climbed the stairs to her childhood bedroom, she found it transformed into something clinical and impersonal. The walls that had once been covered with her artwork and photos were now a neutral beige. Her bookshelf held Linda's romance novels instead of Sarah's journals and poetry collections. The bed was made with hotel crisp linens that had never been slept in. Every trace of her 17 years in this house had been erased. Sarah sat on the edge of the unfamiliar bed, her overnight bag still clutched in her hands. The room felt like a mausoleum, preserved but lifeless, maintaining the appearance of welcome while offering none of its warmth. Her phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. How's it going? Call if you need anything. Remember, you belong wherever you choose to belong. The words made her eyes burn with unexpected tears. She thought about the life she'd built in Denver. Small, but genuine, filled with people who saw her clearly and chose her anyway. The clients who trusted her with their stories. The colleagues who respected her insights. Marcus, who loved her not despite her struggles, but because of the strength she'd found in surviving them. With trembling fingers, she dialed his number. "Hey," his voice was warm, familiar, real. "How are you holding up? I think I made a mistake coming here." The words tumbled out before she could stop them. "Marcus, I don't think I belong here anymore. I'm not sure I ever did." Sarah's conversation with Marcus had lasted until nearly midnight, his steady voice serving as an anchor to reality while the house settled into silence around her. She'd fallen asleep clutching her phone and woke to the sound of Claire's laughter, drifting up from the kitchen. Bright, performative, designed to carry. The digital clock read 7:23 a.m. Sarah lay still for a moment, listening to the familiar symphony of morning sounds she'd once taken for granted. The coffee maker's gurgle, her father's heavy footsteps on the stairs, the rustle of newspaper pages. It should have felt like coming home. Instead, it felt like eavesdropping on strangers. When she finally made her way downstairs, she found Claire already stationed at the kitchen island, perfectly dressed in yoga pants and a cashmere pullover, nursing a cup of coffee while scrolling through her phone. She looked up as Sarah entered, and her smile was like a scalpel, sharp, precise, designed to cut. "Well, look who's finally up. I was starting to worry you'd had another episode." The word episode hung in the air like smoke. Sarah felt her chest tighten, but forced her voice to remain steady. "Just tired from the drive." "Of course." Claire's tone dripped understanding, but her eyes remained cold. "Travel can be so hard when you're fragile." Linda bustled in from the dining room, already dressed for the day in her carefully coordinated outfit, the same style she'd worn for the past 20 years, as if change itself were dangerous. "Oh, good morning, sweetheart. I was just setting out some photo albums. I thought you might want to look through them, catch up on everything you've missed." Sarah followed her mother into the dining room, where several photo albums were spread across the polished table like evidence in a court case. But as she began flipping through them, a creeping wrongness settled in her stomach. The chronology felt off, manipulated. Her high school graduation photo, the one where she'd been so proud of her scholarship to State University, was buried in the back of an album, tucked between random vacation shots. Meanwhile, Claire's achievements were prominently displayed. Her college graduation magna cum laude, her wedding to Tyler's father, her promotion to marketing director. It was as if Sarah's accomplishments had been systematically minimized, relegated to afterthoughts. "This isn't right," Sarah murmured, pulling out her graduation photo. In it, she was beaming, flanked by both parents who looked genuinely proud. She remembered that day clearly. How Bob had tears in his eyes when she walked across the stage, how Linda had insisted on taking dozens of photos. "What's not right, honey?" Linda's voice carried a note of caution. "This photo. It used to be in the main album, in the family achievements section. I remember because you said it was going right next to Claire's." "Oh, Sarah." Linda's laugh was nervous, dismissive. "Your memory. Well, you know how stress can affect things. That photo was always in the back. We have so many pictures, it's hard to keep track." But Sarah knew. She remembered Linda carefully placing that photo in the front album. Remembered her mother's pride in having both daughters achieve academic success. The certainty of her memory clashed violently with the evidence before her, creating a disorienting vertigo that made her grip the table's edge. Claire appeared in the doorway, coffee mug in hand, watching the exchange with interest. "Everything okay in here?" "Just looking at old photos," Linda said quickly. Sarah was confused about where her graduation picture was placed. Confused. Claire's repetition of the word was gentle, almost sympathetic, but it landed like a diagnosis. That's understandable. Memory can be so unreliable, especially when someone's been under stress for so long. The implication hung heavy in the air. Sarah looked between her mother and sister, searching for any acknowledgement of the subtle cruelty in Claire's words. But Linda was nodding along as if Claire had made a perfectly reasonable observation. "Maybe we should put these away," Linda said, already reaching for the albums. "I don't want to overwhelm you on your first morning back." Overwhelm. Another loaded word, another gentle suggestion that Sarah was too fragile for normal family activities. She wanted to protest, to insist on looking through every album until she found proof that her memories were accurate. But the concerned expressions on both women's faces made her feel like she was being unreasonable. "I think I'll just get some coffee," Sarah said, retreating to the kitchen. Bob was there, hidden behind his newspaper as always, but he looked up when she entered. For a moment, Sarah saw something in his eyes, recognition, maybe even warmth, but it was quickly shuttered. Behind polite distance. "Morning, kiddo. Sleep okay?" "Fine. Thanks." She poured herself coffee, hoping the familiar ritual would ground her. "Dad, do you remember my high school graduation? You cried when I walked across the stage." Bob's newspaper rustled as he shifted uncomfortably. "Well, I cry at everything. You know me." But his eyes wouldn't meet hers, and something in his tone suggested he wanted to end this conversation quickly. "You said you were proud of me for getting the scholarship. You said—" "Sarah." His voice carried a warning she'd never heard before. "That was a long time ago. I don't remember every detail." But he did remember. She could see it in the way his hands gripped the newspaper, in the slight tension around his eyes. He remembered, but for some reason, he was choosing not to acknowledge it. Claire breezed back into the kitchen, her presence immediately shifting the atmosphere. "Dad, I was thinking we could go for a walk later. Just the three of us. Like old times." She glanced at Sarah with manufactured sympathy. "Unless Sarah feels up to joining? I know exercise can be challenging when you're dealing with everything. Everything. Mental health issues, depression, the breakdown that had cost Sarah her job and sent her into months of therapy." Claire made it sound like a character, flaw, a personal failing that made Sarah unsuitable for normal activities. "I'm fine," Sarah said tightly. "I've been hiking regularly in Colorado. The altitude there is much more challenging than anything around here." "Oh, that's wonderful." Claire's enthusiasm felt poisonous. "Although I have to say, I worry about you being alone on mountain trails. What if something happened? What if you had another moment? Another moment. Like the panic attack that had hit Sarah during a particularly difficult case, when she'd been working with a family torn apart by addiction and abuse. The attack had been triggered by the father's gaslighting of his wife, the way he systematically undermined her reality until she doubted her own perceptions. Sarah's supervisor had been understanding, encouraging her to take time to process her own trauma responses. But somehow, Claire had learned about it, and was now wielding that knowledge like a weapon. "How do you even know about that?" Sarah's voice came out sharper than she intended. Claire's eyes widened in mock surprise. "Know about what? I'm just expressing normal concern for my sister's safety." "You've always been sensitive, Sarah. There's nothing wrong with acknowledging that." There it was again. The gentle repositioning of Sarah's legitimate mental health struggles as inherent weakness. The subtle suggestion that any strong emotional response was evidence of instability. Sarah felt the familiar spiral beginning, the self-doubt that therapy had taught her to recognize and combat. Linda appeared in the doorway, drawn by the tension. "Girls, please. It's Sarah's first morning back. Can't we just have a nice, peaceful breakfast?" "Of course, Mom." Claire's voice was pure sweetness. "I was just worried about Sarah overexerting herself. You know how I care about my little sister." The words were loving, the tone was caring, but the subtext was clear. Sarah was fragile, unstable, someone to be managed rather than trusted. And their parents were buying it completely. Sarah excused herself to use the bathroom, but instead found herself climbing the stairs to the second floor, drawn by some instinct she couldn't name. The hallway walls were lined with family photos spanning decades, but as she studied them more closely, she began to notice a pattern. Photos from her childhood showed her prominently. Birthday parties, Christmas mornings, family vacations. But as the timeline moved into her teenage years, she seemed to fade into the background. Claire dominated the frame in high school photos, while Sarah appeared increasingly peripheral, often partially cropped out or positioned at the edges. Had it always been this way? She remembered family photo sessions where her mother carefully arranged them, making sure everyone was visible and valued. But these photos told a different story, one where Claire was the star and Sarah was an afterthought. The bathroom door opened down the hall, and Tyler emerged, tall and gangly in pajama pants and an oversized t-shirt. When he saw Sarah studying the photos, he froze, his eyes darting nervously toward the stairs. "Hi," Sarah said softly. "I'm your Aunt Sarah. We met briefly last night." Tyler nodded, but didn't speak. There was something in his expression, caution mixed with what might have been sympathy. He was 17, old enough to understand family dynamics, old enough to see things that adults might miss or choose to ignore. "Nice to meet you properly," Sarah continued. "Your mom says you're doing well in school." "Yeah." His voice was careful, neutral, but his eyes kept flicking toward the photos Sarah had been examining, and something in his expression suggested he understood exactly what she was seeing. "Tyler!" Claire's voice called from downstairs, sharp with authority. "Come down here, please. Don't bother your aunt while she's adjusting." Adjusting. Another clinical term, another gentle suggestion that Sarah's presence was disruptive, that her very existence required accommodation and management. Tyler's shoulders tensed at his mother's tone. He looked at Sarah for a long moment, and she saw something flicker in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. But when Claire called again, more insistently, he hurried toward the stairs, without another word. Sarah remained in the hallway, surrounded by decades of family memories that seemed to have been carefully edited to minimize her importance. The photos that remained told the story Claire wanted told. The perfect older daughter and the troubled younger one. The achiever and the disappointment. The one who belonged and the one who didn't. But Sarah's memories told a different story. She remembered being cherished, celebrated, valued. She remembered her parents' pride in her empathy, her artistic talents, her determination to help others. Those memories felt real, vivid, unshakable. So why did everyone else seem to remember differently? As she made her way back downstairs, she caught a glimpse of Tyler in the living room, his body language tense as Claire spoke to him in low, urgent tones. When they noticed Sarah approaching, the conversation stopped abruptly, and Claire's smile snapped back into place like a mask. "There you are. I was just telling Tyler about the family dinner plans. Won't it be nice to have everyone together?" Sarah nodded, but her attention was focused on Tyler, who was staring at his hands with an expression she recognized from her work with troubled teens. It was the look of someone caught between loyalty and truth, someone who knew things they weren't allowed to say. For the first time since arriving, Sarah felt a spark of hope. Tyler had been watching, listening, observing. And unlike the adults in this house, he hadn't yet learned to prioritize comfortable lies over difficult truths. If anyone could validate her memories, if anyone could confirm that her reality wasn't as distorted as everyone seemed to believe, it might be the teenager who had been watching it all unfold from the sidelines. The house felt suffocating by mid-afternoon. Sarah had endured another round of subtle undermining during lunch. Claire's concerned observations about Sarah's appetite, Linda's nervous hovering whenever Sarah seemed tired, Bob's careful avoidance of any topic that might lead to meaningful conversation. Every interaction left her feeling more disoriented, more convinced that she was losing her grip on reality. She escaped to the backyard, drawn by a desperate need for air that hadn't been filtered through her family's collective rewriting of history. The November afternoon was crisp, the sky a pale gray that matched her mood. She sat on the old tire, swing her father had hung when she was 8, pulling out her phone to call Marcus again. His voice was a lifeline. "Hey, how's day 2 going? I think I'm going crazy." The words came out in a rush. "Everything I remember, they remember differently. The photos have been rearranged. My graduation picture was moved. Dad won't acknowledge things I know he said. And Claire." Sarah's voice broke slightly. "Claire keeps making these comments about my mental health, like everything I say or do is evidence that I'm unstable." "Sarah, listen to me." Marcus's voice was firm, grounding. "Your memories are valid. Your perceptions are real. Don't let them convince you otherwise." "But what if I am remembering wrong? What if—" "No." The certainty in his voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. "I've known you for 3 years. I've watched you help dozens of families recognize and escape manipulation. You know what gaslighting looks like. Trust your training. Trust yourself. Sarah closed her eyes, letting his words wash over her. He was right. In her professional life, she'd seen this pattern countless times. The systematic undermining of someone's reality. The gentle but persistent suggestion that their perceptions couldn't be trusted. The way abusers used mental health struggles as weapons to discredit their victims. I need evidence, she said finally. Something concrete that proves my memories are accurate. Then find it. And Sarah, be careful. People who are this committed to their version of events don't give up easily when challenged. After hanging up, Sarah remained on the swing, thinking. The late afternoon sun slanted across the yard, casting long shadows that reminded her of playing here as a child. She and Claire had spent countless hours in this backyard, building forts, chasing fireflies, whispering secrets under the old oak tree. When had that changed? When had Claire stopped being her protector and started being her enemy? You look sad. Sarah startled, turning to find Tyler standing a few feet away, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He was tall for his age, all elbows and knees, but his eyes held a maturity that seemed decades older than 17. Just thinking, Sarah said. How long have you been standing there? A few minutes. He glanced back at the house, then stepped closer. Can I ask you something? Of course. Do you remember things differently than Mom tells them? The question was so direct, so honest, that Sarah felt her breath catch. What do you mean? Tyler was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the ground. When he looked up, his expression was carefully neutral, but something desperate flickered in his eyes. She's been talking about you for months, planning for your visit like it was some kind of campaign, taking notes, practicing conversations, organizing her stories. Sarah's heart began to race. What kind of notes? Tyler glanced toward the house again, then sat down on the ground near the swing, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Everything. What she was going to say about your childhood. How she was going to bring up your breakdown. She has this whole narrative about why you left, and it's not. He struggled with the words. It's not what I remember hearing 2 years ago. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What do you remember? Pieces. I was 15, so I wasn't paying attention to all the details. But I remember you calling, trying to work things out. I remember you crying on the phone with Grandma Linda about how Mom was making you feel unwelcome. And I remember Mom being really angry about something you'd said about her divorce. Sarah's memory sharpened with painful clarity. She'd been concerned about Tyler, had suggested gently that Claire might benefit from family therapy to help him process his parents' separation. Claire had exploded, accusing Sarah of trying to turn her own son against her, of using her psychology degree to analyze a situation she didn't understand. She told everyone you just disappeared, Tyler continued. That you stopped returning calls, stopped caring about the family. But I heard her talking to her friends about how she'd finally put you in your place. The validation hit Sarah like a physical relief, the first real confirmation that her memories weren't fabricated. Tyler, why are you telling me this? He was quiet for so long that Sarah wondered if he'd changed his mind about talking. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion he was trying to hide. Because I've been watching her do it to Dad since the divorce. Little comments about his memory. Suggestions that he's getting confused in his old age. She's moved, back in and slowly taken over everything, the finances, the social calendar, even what groceries get bought. And Grandma and Grandpa just let her. They think she's protecting them, helping them, but really, she's controlling them. Sarah felt pieces clicking into place. Claire's divorce hadn't just been about losing her marriage. It had been about losing control. Moving back in with their parents had given her a new arena to dominate, new people to manage. And Sarah's return threatened that carefully constructed power structure. She's scared of you, Tyler said suddenly. That's why she's working so hard to make everyone think you're unstable. She knows you see through her. How do you know all this? Tyler pulled his phone from his pocket, his fingers hesitating over the screen. Because I've been recording some of her phone calls. Not all of them, he added quickly, seeing Sarah's expression. Just the ones where she talks about you or about managing Grandma and Grandpa. I started doing it after I heard her telling her friend how easy it was to handle confused elderly people. Sarah's social worker training kicked in. Tyler, that's incredibly brave, but also dangerous. If she found out, she won't. I'm careful. His jaw set with determination that reminded Sarah painfully of herself at that age. But Sarah, you need to know what she's really doing. She's not just rewriting your history, she's rewriting everything. He showed her his phone, scrolling through voice memos with dates and timestamps. This one's from last week. She's talking to her friend about how she convinced Dad that his memory problems are getting worse. How she had to take over paying bills because he was making mistakes that I'm pretty sure she made herself. Sarah's hands trembled as she stared at the phone. Tyler, this is evidence of elder abuse. This could be serious legal trouble for your mother. I know. His voice was steady, but his hands shook slightly. That's why I need your help. You know about this stuff, right? You help families like ours? The weight of the situation settled on Sarah's shoulders. This wasn't just about her own vindication anymore. Tyler was trapped in a house with a master manipulator who was systematically isolating and controlling vulnerable adults. And he was just 17, legally powerless to intervene. We need to be very careful, Sarah said slowly. Your mother is smart, and she's been planning this for a long time. If we move too fast or make her feel cornered, she could escalate. Tyler nodded, his expression serious beyond his years. What do we do? Sarah thought about Marcus's words, about trusting her training. In her professional life, she'd helped families navigate exactly this kind of situation. The gradual recognition that someone they trusted was systematically undermining their autonomy and reality. First, we document everything. Every conversation, every misremembered story, every time she contradicts verifiable facts. And we do it carefully, quietly, without giving her any reason to suspect what we're doing. And then we find allies. People who remember the truth, who aren't invested in her version of events. Sarah thought about Aunt Diane, about the way Claire's expression had flickered with annoyance when Tyler mentioned her arrival tomorrow. Tell me about Aunt Diane. What's Claire's relationship with her like? Tyler's face brightened slightly. Terrible. Aunt Diane sees right through Mom's act. She's always making comments about Mom's dramatic tendencies and asking pointed questions about why you never visit anymore. Mom hates her, but has to be polite because Grandpa won't hear a word against his sister. Hope sparked in Sarah's chest. An adult family member who couldn't be manipulated, who remembered the family dynamics clearly, who had the authority to challenge Claire's narrative. It was exactly what they needed. Tyler, I need you to promise me something. Don't confront your mother directly, no matter how frustrated you get. And if you ever feel unsafe, if she starts directing her manipulation at you more aggressively, you call me immediately, okay? He nodded solemnly. What about tonight? She's planning some big family bonding evening, movies and popcorn, the whole fake happy family thing. Sarah thought about it. We play along, we observe, we gather information, and we wait for Aunt Diane. As they sat in the gathering dusk, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since arriving home. Clarity. Her memories weren't distorted. Her perceptions weren't unreliable. She was being systematically gaslighted by someone who had turned manipulation into an art form. But now, she wasn't alone. Tyler's courage in reaching out, in documenting the truth despite his own vulnerable position, reminded her of why she'd become a social worker in the first place. Some situations required intervention. Some truths demanded to be heard. And sometimes, the most unlikely allies were the ones who mattered most. Thank you, she said quietly, for trusting me, for telling me the truth. Tyler looked at her, with eyes that held far too much knowledge for someone his age. Thank you for coming back. I was starting to think I was the only one who could see it. As they walked back toward the house, Sarah felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. This wasn't just about reclaiming her own place in the family anymore. It was about protecting two elderly people from financial and emotional abuse, supporting a teenager who was trying to do the right thing in an impossible situation, and stopping a master manipulator who had been operating unchecked for far too long. The house glowed warmly in the evening light, picture perfect from the outside. But Sarah now understood that some of the most dangerous dysfunction happened behind closed doors, disguised as care and concern, enabled by good intentions and willful blindness. Tomorrow, Aunt Diane would arrive, and with her would come the first real challenge to Claire's carefully constructed kingdom of lies. Sarah woke before dawn, her mind sharp with purpose for the first time since arriving. Tyler's revelations had shifted everything. She wasn't fighting for her sanity anymore. She was fighting for truth. The difference gave her strength she'd forgotten she possessed. She spent the early morning hours in her sterile bedroom, organizing her thoughts and preparing her strategy. Her social work training had taught her that confronting manipulation required patience, documentation, and careful timing. Direct attacks often backfired, causing manipulators to become more subtle and dangerous. But strategic challenges, backed by evidence and delivered with precision, could crack even the most carefully constructed facades. When she came downstairs at 7:30, she found the family already gathered in the kitchen. Claire was at the stove, making what appeared to be an elaborate breakfast spread. Fresh fruit, homemade pancakes, bacon perfectly arranged on a platter. The scene was Norman Rockwell perfect, designed to showcase Claire's role as the nurturing family caretaker. "Good morning, sweetheart," Linda beamed from her seat at the kitchen island. "Claire's been up since 6 making this wonderful breakfast. Isn't she thoughtful?" "Very thoughtful," Sarah agreed, studying her sister's performance. Claire was dressed in a soft pink sweater that made her look younger, more vulnerable. Her hair was pulled back in a style that emphasized her delicate features. Every detail was calculated to reinforce her image as the self-sacrificing daughter. "I wanted to do something special for your last full day," Claire said, her voice warm with apparent sincerity. "Family time is so precious, especially when we don't get to see each other often." The subtle emphasis on "don't get to see each other often" was classic Claire, a gentle reminder of Sarah's absence, phrased as wistful regret rather than accusation. But Sarah was ready for this now. "That's so sweet of you," Sarah said, settling at the island next to her father. "It reminds me of how you used to make Sunday breakfast when I was in high school. Remember, Dad? Those last few months before I left for college, Claire would get up early and make these elaborate meals. You said it was like she was trying to make up for lost time." Bob looked up from his coffee, a flicker of memory crossing his face. Yes, I think I remember that." Claire's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Oh, I don't remember it quite that way. I think you might be thinking of Mom's Sunday breakfasts." "No, it was definitely you," Sarah continued conversationally. "Mom, you were working those weekend shifts at the tutoring center, remember? You said you felt guilty about missing Sunday mornings with the family, so Claire stepped in. You were so grateful." Linda's brow furrowed slightly. "I worked weekends at the tutoring center?" "After the budget cuts," Sarah prompted gently. "When they eliminated your aide position during the day, you picked up weekend hours to help make ends meet while I was getting ready for college. Claire was amazing. She made sure Dad and I still had our Sunday family time." Sarah watched Claire's face carefully as she spoke, noting the way her sister's jaw tightened with each specific detail. These weren't vague reminiscences that could be dismissed or reframed. They were concrete memories with timelines and context that could be verified. "That sounds like something I would do," Claire said carefully. "But honestly, those years are a bit of a blur. So much was happening with your college preparations and everything. Everything." Sarah recognized the loaded pause, the invitation for the family to fill in the blanks with whatever narrative Claire had constructed about Sarah's final year at home. But instead of taking the bait, Sarah pressed forward. "Actually, that reminds me of something I wanted to ask about." Sarah pulled out her phone, scrolling to a screenshot she'd taken months ago during a moment of nostalgia. I was looking through old texts the other day and found this conversation with Mom from 2 years ago, right after I'd started the new job in Denver. She held up the phone, showing a text exchange where Linda had written, "So proud of you starting. Fresh. Dad and I are here if you need anything. Don't let Claire's drama get to you. She's still processing the divorce." The silence in the kitchen was deafening. Linda stared at the phone screen, her face cycling through confusion, recognition, and something that might have been embarrassment. Bob set down his coffee cup with careful precision. Claire's smile remained frozen in place, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the spatula. I don't remember sending that," Linda said slowly. "It's right here in my phone," Sarah said gently, "with the timestamp and everything. September 15th, 2022 at 2:47 p.m. You'd just finished telling me about Claire moving back home, and I was worried about how she was handling everything. That doesn't sound like something I would say about Claire." Linda's voice was uncertain, but there was something underneath, the beginning of memory reasserting itself. Claire moved swiftly to damage control. "Oh, Mom, you were so stressed during my divorce. You said a lot of things you didn't mean. Remember how worried you were about my mental state? You probably sent that text when you were upset with me about something silly." But Sarah was ready for the deflection. "Actually, let me show you the full conversation." She scrolled up in the text thread. "See? We were talking about my new caseload, and you were asking about my supervisor. Then you mentioned that Claire was having a hard time adjusting to single motherhood, and you were proud of how I was giving her space to figure things out instead of trying to fix everything for her." Each detail was like a small explosion in the careful narrative Claire had constructed. Linda's face was increasingly troubled as she stared at the evidence of her own words. Words that directly contradicted the story she'd been told and retold about Sarah's abandonment of the family. "I remember that conversation," Bob said suddenly, his voice quiet but firm. "You were in the garden when you called Sarah. You came in afterward and said you were proud of how mature she was being about Claire's situation." The betrayal in Claire's eyes was swift and venomous before she caught herself. "Dad, your memory has been a little scattered lately. Remember what the doctor said about stress affecting recall? My memory is fine." Bob's voice carried an edge Sarah hadn't heard in years. "And I remember being proud of Sarah for giving you space when you needed it." Sarah felt a surge of gratitude toward her father, but she could see Claire regrouping, preparing to escalate. The kitchen felt charged with tension, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," Claire said, her voice beginning to tremble. "Sarah, I know you're still angry about things that happened during my divorce, but bringing up old texts and trying to make Mom and Dad question their own memories, it's not fair." The pivot was masterful. Suddenly, Sarah wasn't revealing evidence. She was attacking a vulnerable woman with unfair tactics. Claire's eyes filled with tears that looked completely genuine. "I'm not trying to make anyone question anything," Sarah said carefully. "I'm just sharing what actually happened." "But why?" Claire's voice broke slightly. "Why are you doing this? I'm trying so hard to rebuild my life after everything fell apart, and now you're here picking apart every conversation, every memory. It feels like you want to hurt me." Linda immediately moved to comfort Claire, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Oh, honey. I'm sure Sarah doesn't mean to upset you." "I don't," Sarah said quickly, hating how Claire's performance was working, despite everything. "I just want us to remember things the way they actually happened." "But why does it matter?" Bob asked, though his tone was more confused than accusatory. "We're family. Can't we just move forward?" The question hung in the air, and Sarah realized she was at a crossroads. She could back down, accept the family's desire for comfortable peace over difficult truth. Or she could push forward, knowing that Claire would escalate in response. Tyler appeared in the doorway, his timing too perfect to be accidental. He'd been listening. "Maybe because lies matter," he said quietly, his young voice carrying surprising authority. "Maybe because pretending things didn't happen doesn't make them unhappen." Claire whirled toward her son, her mask slipping for just a moment to reveal something cold and furious. "Tyler, This is an adult conversation. Please go upstairs. No, Tyler said, stepping fully into the kitchen. I live here too, and I remember things about Aunt Sarah that don't match what you've been saying. The kitchen went dead silent. Sarah could see Claire calculating, trying to decide how to handle this unexpected rebellion from her own son. Linda and Bob looked between Tyler and Claire with growing confusion and concern. Tyler, sweetheart. Claire's voice was sugar-sweet with underlying steel. You were just a child when all this happened. Sometimes we remember things differently than they actually were. I wasn't a child 2 years ago, Tyler said steadily. I was 15, and I remember you practicing conversations about Aunt Sarah. I remember you planning what you were going to tell Grandma and Grandpa about why she stopped calling. Sarah felt her heart race. Tyler was taking an enormous risk, directly challenging his mother in front of witnesses. But his courage was giving her the opening she needed. Tyler, she said gently, you don't have to. Yes, I do, he interrupted. Because someone has to tell the truth. Claire's composure cracked entirely. How dare you? How dare you turn my own son against me? She whirled toward Sarah, her face twisted with rage. This is what you do, isn't it? You come in here with your psychology training and your victim complex, and you poison everyone against me, just like you tried to do during my divorce. I never tried to poison anyone, Sarah said, keeping her voice calm despite her racing heart. I suggested family therapy to help Tyler process the divorce. That's not poisoning, that's caring. Caring? Claire laughed, the sound harsh and brittle. You wanted to dissect my marriage in front of my teenage son. You wanted to make me look like a failure as a mother and a wife. I wanted to help, Sarah said simply. You wanted to be the hero, Claire shot back. Just like always. Saint Sarah, swooping in to save everyone with her social work degree and her superior understanding of family dynamics. Well, look how that worked out for you. You couldn't even save yourself. The words hit like physical blows, each one designed to wound. Sarah felt the familiar spiral beginning, the self-doubt, the shame about her breakdown, the fear that maybe Claire was right about everything. But then she looked at Tyler, saw the horror in his young face as he witnessed his mother's cruelty. She thought about Marcus's voice on the phone, reminding her to trust her training. She remembered all the families she'd helped recognize and escape exactly this kind of systematic emotional abuse. You're right, Sarah said quietly. I couldn't save myself. I had a breakdown trying to help a family where the father was gaslighting his wife so systematically that she'd lost all sense of her own reality. The case triggered my own trauma responses because I recognized the pattern. I'd been living with it my whole life. Claire's face went pale. What are you saying? I'm saying that my breakdown wasn't a sign of weakness or instability. It was my mind finally recognizing what you'd been doing to me for decades, and I'm saying that I won't let you do it to Mom and Dad. Not anymore. The kitchen erupted into chaos. Linda was crying. Bob was demanding explanations. Claire was alternating between outraged denials and wounded sobs. But through it all, Tyler stood steady, his presence a reminder that truth, once spoken, couldn't be taken back. Sarah had fired her first real shot in the war for her family's reality. Now she had to be ready for Claire's retaliation. The house felt like a powder keg for the rest of the morning. After the kitchen confrontation, Claire had retreated to her room with a migraine. Linda had busied herself with aggressive cleaning, and Bob had disappeared into his study with strict instructions, not to be disturbed. Only Tyler seemed unchanged, moving through the house with the calm purpose of someone who had finally stopped carrying a secret. Sarah found him in the garage an hour later, sitting on the workbench with his laptop open, surrounded by old photo albums and boxes that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. What are you doing? She asked. Building our case, Tyler said without looking up. Mom's not the only one who can organize evidence. Sarah moved closer and saw that he'd created a detailed timeline on his laptop, cross-referencing family events with photos, emails, and what appeared to be transcripts of recorded conversations. The level of organization was impressive for a 17-year-old, but the content was heartbreaking, a meticulous documentation of years of manipulation and control. Tyler, this is incredible work, but I'm worried about you. If your mother finds out, she won't, he said confidently. She thinks I'm just a dumb teenager who doesn't pay attention to adult things. She has no idea how much I actually see. He pulled up a folder labeled financial stuff and showed Sarah a series of bank statements he'd photographed with his phone. Look at this. Grandpa's been letting Mom handle the bills since she moved back, right? But watch what happens to the accounts. Sarah studied the documents, her social work training helping her spot the patterns Tyler had identified. Over the past 18 months, there had been a steady stream of unexplained withdrawals from Bob's checking account, always in amounts just small enough to avoid triggering automatic alerts. Where's this money going? Sarah asked. Mom's personal account, Tyler said grimly. I found the deposit slips in her room. She's been taking about $300 a month and telling Grandpa that bills have gone up. Utilities, insurance, groceries. She inflates everything just enough to cover what she's stealing. Sarah felt sick. Financial abuse of elderly family members was one of the most common and devastating forms of elder exploitation. Tyler, this is serious criminal behavior. I know. But it gets worse. He opened another folder. Remember how she convinced Grandpa that his memory was getting bad? I recorded her practicing fake conversations about bills he'd supposedly forgotten to pay, or mistakes he'd supposedly made. She even messed with his medications one week. Took out pills from his organizer so he'd think he was forgetting to take them. The methodical cruelty of it took Sarah's breath away. Claire hadn't just been gaslighting their parents about past events. She'd been actively undermining Bob's confidence in his own mental capacity to make him more dependent on her. How long has this been going on? Since about 6 months after she moved back. At first, she was just helpful. Taking over little things, organizing stuff, being the perfect daughter. But then she started making comments about how overwhelmed Grandma and Grandpa seemed, how they needed more support, and gradually she just took over everything. Sarah thought about her parents during yesterday's interactions, the way Bob deferred to Claire on decisions, the way Linda seemed nervous about contradicting her. She'd attributed it to normal family dynamics, but now she could see it was something much more sinister. What about your grandfather's sister? Aunt Diane? Has she noticed anything? Tyler's expression brightened slightly. That's why Mom's been so stressed about her visit. Aunt Diane came for Easter and immediately started asking pointed questions about the finances and why Grandpa seemed so confused about things he used to handle easily. Mom spent weeks after that visit doing damage control. Sarah felt a surge of hope. An outside observer who couldn't be manipulated or controlled, who had legitimate authority to question the family's new dynamics. Aunt Diane could be the key to everything. Tyler, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Are you prepared for what might happen when we expose all this? Your mother could face criminal charges. Your grandparents might need significant support to recover from this abuse. And you might have to live with my dad, Tyler finished. Yeah, I've thought about that. And honestly, it would be a relief. The matter-of-fact way he said it broke Sarah's heart. She thought about all the teenage clients she'd worked with who'd been forced to become adults too early, who'd had to choose between loyalty and safety, who'd learned to recognize manipulation before they'd learned to drive. You shouldn't have to make this choice, she said softly. But I do have to make it, Tyler replied. Because if I don't, she'll just keep getting worse, and eventually she'll destroy Grandma and Grandpa completely. They spent the next hour organizing Tyler's evidence into a coherent narrative. Sarah's professional experience helped her identify the most compelling documentation, the financial records that showed clear patterns of theft, the audio recordings that demonstrated premeditation, the photos of altered medication schedules that proved deliberate sabotage. We need to get this information to someone who can act on it, Sarah said finally. Adult Protective Services, the police, maybe both. But first, we need to make sure your grandparents are safe and that you have somewhere secure to go if Claire realizes what we're doing. Tyler nodded, but his expression was troubled. There's something else. Something I haven't told you yet. Sarah felt her stomach drop. What? Mom's been talking to Grandma and Grandpa about getting power of attorney. She says it's just for emergencies in case something happens and they can't make decisions for themselves. But I heard her on the phone with her lawyer last week, and it sounded like she was planning to use it for more than emergencies. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. If Claire gained legal power of attorney over their parents, financial and medical decisions, she could isolate them completely. Move them to a facility where their contact with the outside world was limited. Control their money, their health care, their ability to communicate with people who might question her actions. When is this supposed to happen? Soon, maybe as early as next week. She's been talking about how stressful the holidays are for elderly people, how it might be better if she could handle more of their responsibilities. Sarah's mind raced through the implications. Once Claire had legal authority, undoing the damage would become exponentially more difficult. Courts were reluctant to overturn power of attorney arrangements without overwhelming evidence of abuse, and Claire was smart enough to cover her tracks once she had complete control. "We have to move faster than I thought," Sarah said. "Tyler, I need you to call Marcus, my friend who drove me here. He's staying at the hotel in town. Can you get away for a few hours this afternoon?" "Yeah, I think so. Why?" "Because we need to make copies of all this evidence and get it into the hands of people who can't be manipulated or threatened. And we need to do it before Aunt Diane arrives tomorrow, because her presence is going to force Claire to escalate." Tyler was already packing up his laptop. "What do you think she'll do?" Sarah thought about the cold fury in Claire's eyes during the kitchen confrontation, the way she'd pivoted so smoothly from victim to aggressor and back again. Claire was cornered now, facing the exposure of years of carefully constructed lies. Cornered manipulators were dangerous. They often resorted to increasingly desperate tactics to maintain control. "I think she's going to try to discredit us." "Before we can discredit her," Sarah said, "she's going to use every weapon she has. My mental health history, your age, our supposed collaboration against her. She's going to paint us as unstable conspirators who can't be trusted." "And if that doesn't work?" Sarah remembered Claire's comment about Sarah's breakdown, the surgical precision with which she'd aimed for Sarah's most vulnerable spots. "If that doesn't work, she's going to go nuclear. She's going to reveal something that she thinks will destroy my credibility completely." Tyler's face was grim but determined. "Then we better make sure our evidence is bulletproof before she gets the chance." As they prepared to leave the garage, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders again. She was no longer just fighting for her own place in the family. She was fighting to protect two elderly people from ongoing abuse and to support a teenager who was showing more courage than most adults she knew. But she also felt something she hadn't experienced since arriving home: confidence. Tyler's documentation had given her the evidence she needed to trust her own perceptions. His courage had reminded her of her own strength, and tomorrow, Aunt Diane would arrive with the outside perspective and family authority they needed to challenge Claire's narrative effectively. Claire might have spent 2 years preparing for Sarah's return, but she hadn't counted on Tyler's intelligence and integrity. She hadn't expected Sarah to arrive with professional training in recognizing abuse patterns, and she certainly hadn't anticipated that her own son would become her most damaging witness. The war for the Morrison family's reality was about to escalate, but for the first time since arriving home, Sarah felt like she might actually win. Sarah and Tyler had spent 3 hours at Marcus's hotel, methodically copying files, organizing evidence, and developing their strategy for the next day's confrontation with Aunt Diane. Marcus had proven invaluable, his calm presence and outside perspective helping them see patterns they might have missed. His legal knowledge ensuring they documented everything properly for potential future proceedings. They returned to the house just after 5 o'clock, expecting to find the family preparing for dinner. Instead, they walked into what felt like a funeral parlor. Linda sat at the kitchen table with red-rimmed eyes, tissues scattered around her, like fallen leaves. Bob stood by the window, his shoulders rigid with tension. And Claire sat across from her mother, perfectly composed except for the strategic tear tracks on her cheeks. "There you are," Claire said, her voice heavy with what sounded like relief mixed with sorrow. "We need to talk. All of us." Sarah felt Tyler tense beside her. Something had shifted in the house's atmosphere while they were gone. The careful balance of the morning's confrontation had been replaced by something that felt orchestrated, prepared. "What's going on?" Sarah asked, though every instinct told her she didn't want to know the answer. "Sit down, sweetheart," Linda said, her voice thick with tears. "Claire has shared some things with us. Some very concerning things. Sarah remained standing, her social worker training screaming warnings about staged interventions and manufactured crises. What kind of things? Claire looked up at her with an expression of perfect, devastating sympathy. Sarah, I know this is going to be hard to hear, but I've been worried about you since you arrived. The things you've been saying, the way you've been acting. It reminded me of how you were, right before your breakdown. The words landed like physical blows. Sarah felt Tyler shift protectively closer to her. But her focus was entirely on Claire's face, the careful calculation hidden behind manufactured concern. What are you talking about? The paranoid thinking, Claire continued gently. The way you've been questioning everyone's memories, insisting that we're all wrong about things that happened years ago. The conspiracy theories about me manipulating the family. It's exactly how you were when you called me that night. Sarah's blood turned to ice. What night? Claire's eyes filled with fresh tears. Perfectly timed, perfectly calibrated. The night you tried to kill yourself. The silence in the kitchen was deafening. Linda let out a small sob. Bob's knuckles went white where he gripped the window frame. Tyler's sharp intake of breath was the only sound until Claire continued, her voice breaking with apparent emotion. You called me that night, completely convinced that your supervisors at work were plotting against you, that your clients' families were lying about you, that everyone in your life was part of some conspiracy to destroy you. You were so paranoid, so convinced that everyone was gaslighting you. Claire's voice trailed off meaningfully. That's not what happened, Sarah said, but her voice sounded weak, uncertain even to her own ears. Isn't it? Claire's tone was infinitely gentle, infinitely patient. You called me at 2 a.m, crying and talking about how you couldn't trust your own perceptions anymore. How everything felt like a lie. You said you couldn't live with the confusion. With not knowing what was real. Sarah's memory of that night was fragmented, clouded by the psychiatric medication she'd been taking and the overwhelming emotional crisis that had led to her hospitalization. She remembered feeling desperate, confused, unable to trust her own judgment about anything. But she also remembered calling Claire for support, for the sister she'd once trusted above everyone else. I called you because I needed help, Sarah said, but doubt was creeping into her voice. And I tried to help, Claire said, tears flowing freely now. I stayed on the phone with you for hours, trying to talk you down, trying to convince you to check yourself into the hospital, but you kept insisting that everyone was lying to you, that I was part of some plot against you. And then you said... Claire's voice broke entirely, and she buried her face in her hands. Linda immediately moved to comfort her, while Bob turned from the window with an expression of profound sadness. What did I say? Sarah whispered, though she was terrified to know the answer. You said it would be easier for everyone if you were just gone, Claire sobbed, that maybe everyone would be happier without you questioning everything, without you making everyone's life complicated with your problems. The words hit Sarah like a physical assault, because they sounded familiar. Not exactly right, but close enough to her fragmented memories that she couldn't definitively deny them. She remembered the crushing despair of that night, the feeling that her perception of reality was so distorted that she couldn't trust herself to exist in the world. But that's not... I didn't. Sarah struggled to form words, her professional training warring with her personal trauma. Mom and Dad didn't know, Claire continued, speaking to the family rather than to Sarah. I never told them because I didn't want them to blame themselves. But I've been watching Sarah since she arrived, and I'm seeing all the same signs. The paranoid thinking, the accusations, the insistence that everyone else's memories are wrong, and only hers are correct. Linda was crying openly now. Oh, Sarah, why didn't you tell us how bad things had gotten? That's exactly the problem, Claire said softly. She doesn't recognize when she's in crisis. That night, right up until the paramedics arrived, she was convinced that everyone else was the problem. She couldn't see that her own perceptions were distorted. Sarah felt the room spinning around her. Every eye was on her. Every face showed varying degrees of concern and fear. Even Tyler looked uncertain now, his loyalty warring with the devastating picture Claire was painting. I wasn't paranoid, Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I was dealing with a difficult case, and I was triggered by what you perceived as gaslighting," Claire finished gently. "But Sarah, what if your perception was already distorted? What if you were seeing manipulation and conspiracy where there was just normal human interaction?" The question pierced through Sarah's defenses like a blade, because it was exactly the doubt that had haunted her during recovery. How could she trust her own judgment about anything when her mind had betrayed her so completely that night? "This is what I was afraid of," Claire continued, her voice heavy with sorrow. "This is why I was so hesitant about you coming home. Not because I don't love you, but because I was terrified that the stress of family dynamics would trigger another episode." Bob finally spoke, his voice gruff with emotion. "What do you think we should do?" Claire looked around the room with the expression of someone carrying an enormous burden. "I think Sarah needs professional help. Real help, not just the kind of therapy that tells her she's right to question everyone else's reality. She needs someone who can help her recognize when her perceptions are distorted." "I am getting professional help," Sarah said desperately. "My therapist in Denver." "Your therapist who encouraged you to reconnect with family despite knowing your history of paranoid episodes?" Claire's tone was still gentle, but the implication was clear. "Sarah, what if your therapist is telling you what you want to hear instead of what you need to hear?" The systematic destruction of every support system, every source of validation in Sarah's life, was masterful. Claire wasn't just attacking Sarah's credibility, she was isolating her from anyone who might provide alternative perspectives. "I've been watching Tyler spending time with you," Claire continued, "and I'm worried that you're involving him in your conspiracy theories. Earlier, he said some very concerning things about me that sounded exactly like the paranoid accusations you made on the phone that night." Tyler's face went pale. Sarah could see him struggling, torn between what he knew to be true and the devastating portrait his mother was painting of mental illness and distorted perception. "Mom, that's not—" Tyler started, but Claire cut him off with a look of infinite sadness. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," she said. "Sarah, when you're in crisis, you draw other people into your distorted worldview. You did it with that family at work, convincing yourself that the father was abusing his wife when he was actually trying to get her help for her mental illness. And now you're doing it with Tyler." Sarah felt like she was drowning. Every fact was being twisted, every memory reframed, every support system undermined. The case Claire was referring to had been the opposite, a clear situation of psychological abuse that Sarah had correctly identified. But sitting in this kitchen, surrounded by family members who looked at her with fear and pity, she couldn't summon the certainty to defend herself. "The recording," Tyler said suddenly, his voice stronger than Sarah felt. "We have recordings of—" "Recordings of what?" Claire's voice was infinitely patient. "Tyler, your aunt is very sick right now. People in mental health crises often believe they're gathering evidence of conspiracies against them. They record normal conversations and hear threat and manipulation where none exists." Sarah watched Tyler's confidence crumble as Claire systematically destroyed his reality the same way she'd destroyed Sarah's. The teenager looked between his mother and his aunt, his face a mask of confusion and growing doubt. "I know this is hard," Claire said, addressing the whole family now. "I know you all want to believe that Sarah is just misunderstood, that her problems are everyone else's fault. But sometimes the kindest thing we can do for someone we love is to stop enabling their illness and help them get the treatment they really need." Linda was nodding through her tears. Bob looked like he'd aged a decade in the past hour. Even Tyler seemed to be wavering, his 17-year-old mind no match for his mother's decades of manipulative expertise. Sarah felt completely alone, more isolated than she'd ever been in her life. Claire had weaponized her most vulnerable moment, her deepest shame, and used it to discredit not just her current accusations, but her entire perception of reality. "I need some air," Sarah managed to say, her voice barely audible. As she walked toward the back door, she heard Claire's voice behind her, warm with false compassion. "Of course, sweetheart. Take all the time you need. We're here for you. No matter what." The evening air was cold against Sarah's face as she collapsed onto the porch steps. Her phone buzzed. Marcus, probably wondering how things had gone. but she couldn't face explaining what had just happened. Couldn't admit that Claire had found the perfect weapon to destroy her credibility. Because what if Claire was right? What if Sarah's perceptions really were distorted? What if she was seeing manipulation and abuse where there was just a complicated family trying to deal with her mental illness? The doubt was like poison, seeping through every memory, every conviction, every moment of clarity she'd achieved since arriving home. And in that doubt, Claire's victory was complete. Sarah sat on the hotel room floor, her back against the bed, while Marcus held her as she shook with sobs that seemed to come from the very core of her being. She'd called him from the porch, barely able to form words, and he'd driven immediately to pick her up from the corner 2 blocks from her parents' house. "I can't tell what's real anymore," she whispered against his shoulder. "What if she's right? What if I am seeing things that aren't there?" Marcus's arms tightened around her. "Sarah, listen to me. I've known you for 3 years. I've watched you work with dozens of families in crisis. You don't see conspiracies where none exist. You see patterns that other people miss because you've learned to recognize them. But that night," Sarah's voice broke, "the night I called Claire before the hospital. I don't remember it clearly. The medication, the crisis. What if I really was paranoid? What if I really did drag Tyler into some delusion? What do you remember about that night? Not what Claire says you said, but what you actually remember." Sarah closed her eyes, trying to push through the haze of trauma and psychiatric medication to the core of that terrible evening. "I remember feeling like I was losing my mind. I remember calling Claire because she was the only person I thought I could trust. I remember." She paused, something sharp and clear cutting through the fog of doubt. "I remember her not answering the first 3 times I called. When she finally picked up, she sounded annoyed, like I was interrupting something. And I remember her asking me if I'd been drinking, if I'd taken anything. She seemed more concerned about my state than about what I was saying." Marcus's voice was gentle but firm. "What were you saying? What did you need help with?" "The case, the Hendricks family. The father was—" Sarah's memory sharpened with sudden, painful clarity. He was systematically destroying his wife's confidence, making her question her own perceptions about their son's behavior. She kept telling me that something was wrong with the boy, that he was being violent and aggressive. But every time I met with the family, the father would have explanations for everything. He made her sound hysterical, unstable. "What happened with that case?" "After I went on medical leave, another social worker took over. 3 weeks later, the mother finally had enough courage to take her son to the hospital for a full evaluation. They found evidence of ongoing physical abuse. The father had been coaching the boy to lie, threatening him if he told anyone about the violence at home." Sarah sat up abruptly, the full implication hitting her. "Marcus, I was right. My instincts were correct. The mother wasn't hysterical. She was being gaslit by an expert manipulator. And when I tried to document it, when I started seeing the patterns clearly, that's when I had my breakdown." "Because recognizing the abuse triggered your own trauma responses," Marcus said quietly. "Because you'd been living with the same kind of manipulation your entire life." The clarity was like a physical shock. Sarah's breakdown hadn't been caused by paranoid delusions. It had been caused by the devastating recognition of a pattern she'd been trapped in since childhood. Her mind hadn't betrayed her. It had finally started protecting her by recognizing the truth. "She planned this," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Claire knew about my hospitalization, knew about the circumstances that led to it. She weaponized my mental health crisis to discredit everything Tyler and I discovered today." A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Marcus went to answer it, and Sarah heard Tyler's voice in the hallway, young, scared, but determined. "Is Sarah here? I need to talk to her. Please." Marcus looked back at Sarah, who nodded. Tyler entered the room cautiously, his face pale but resolute. In his hands was his laptop and a small digital recorder. "I'm sorry," he said immediately. "I'm sorry I let her make me doubt you, even for a minute. But I couldn't stop thinking about what she said, and I realized—" He sat down heavily in the chair across from them. I realized she did the same thing to my dad during the divorce. Sarah wiped her eyes. What do you mean? The accusations about his mental state, the suggestions that his memory was unreliable, the way she convinced everyone that he was unstable and potentially dangerous. She made him look like the crazy one while she played the victim. Tyler's hands trembled slightly as he opened his laptop. After you left tonight, I went back through all the recordings I have of her phone calls from the past 2 years. Listen to this. He played a recording of Claire's voice, clearly speaking to someone on the phone. The key is consistency. If you tell the same story often enough, with enough emotional conviction, people start to believe it's true, especially if you can make them doubt the other person's stability. Sarah felt her breath catch. When was this recorded? 6 months ago. She was talking to her divorce lawyer about strategy for the custody hearing. Tyler scrolled through. More files. And this one is from last month, right after Mom confirmed you were coming for Thanksgiving. Claire's voice filled the room again. She's always been fragile, but the breakdown proved what I've suspected for years. She can't handle stress without becoming paranoid and delusional. The family will rally around protecting her, but they'll also be very receptive to the idea that she needs help rather than validation. The calculated cruelty of it was breathtaking. Claire hadn't just been planning to discredit Sarah's accusations. She'd been planning to use Sarah's mental health history as a weapon from the moment her visit was confirmed. Tyler, Sarah said softly, this could get you in serious trouble with your mother. Why are you doing this? The teenager looked older than his 17 years as he met her eyes. Because someone has to choose truth over comfort. Because what she's doing to you is exactly what she did to my dad, and what she's doing to Grandma and Grandpa. And because... His voice broke slightly. Because I'm tired of being her son. Marcus had been listening intently to the recordings. Tyler, this is evidence of premeditated psychological abuse. Combined with the financial records you showed us earlier, this could be enough to get Adult Protective Services involved immediately. But will anyone believe us after tonight? Sarah asked. She's painted me as mentally unstable, and him as a confused teenager who's been influenced by my delusions. That's why we need Aunt Diane, Tyler said. Mom can't manipulate her, the way she manipulates everyone else. And there's something else. I overheard her on the phone with her lawyer again tonight. They're moving up the power of attorney paperwork. She wants to have it signed before Aunt Diane gets here tomorrow. Sarah felt panic rising in her chest. We can't let that happen. Once she has legal control over your grandparents' decisions, she won't, Tyler interrupted, because I'm going to stop her. Tyler, no. This is too dangerous for you to handle alone. I'm not handling it alone. Tyler's smile was grim but determined. I called my dad after you left tonight. Told him everything. The recordings, the financial abuse, what Mom did to you. He's driving up from Baltimore tonight with his lawyer. They'll be here first thing in the morning. Sarah stared at him in amazement. You called your father? It turns out Dad's memory wasn't as unreliable as Mom claimed. He remembered a lot of things very clearly, including some recordings he made during their marriage when he started to suspect what she was doing. He's been waiting for the right moment to fight back. Marcus leaned forward. Tyler, what you've done takes incredible courage. But you need to understand. Your mother is going to escalate when she realizes what's happening. People like her don't give up control easily. I know, Tyler said quietly. That's why I'm not going back to the house tonight. Dad's picking me up here. We're going to drive to Aunt Diane's hotel and brief her on everything before she goes to the house tomorrow. Sarah felt a surge of admiration and protectiveness for this remarkable young man who had risked everything to stand up for truth. Tyler, I want you to know, whatever happens tomorrow, you've already done something incredibly brave. You've chosen to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. Like you did, Tyler said simply. Like you've been doing your whole career. As Tyler packed up his laptop and prepared to meet his father, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since arriving home. Hope. Not the desperate hope of someone trying to convince others of her sanity, but the quiet confidence of someone who knew she was surrounded by allies who saw the truth. Claire had won tonight's battle by weaponizing Sarah's mental health history. But she'd also revealed the extent of her manipulation to someone who couldn't be discredited or dismissed. Her own son. And tomorrow, when Aunt Diane arrived with Tyler's father and lawyer, Claire would face the one thing she'd never had to deal with before. Consequences. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" Marcus asked after Tyler left. Sarah thought about the question seriously. Tomorrow would bring confrontation, revelation, and probably the permanent fracturing of her family relationships. Claire wouldn't go down without a fight, and the collateral damage would be enormous. But she also thought about Tyler's courage, about her own professional training, about all the families she'd helped escape exactly this kind of systematic abuse. Some battles were worth fighting, even when the cost was everything you thought you wanted. "I'm ready," she said finally. "Not because I want to destroy my family, but because I want to save the parts of it that can still be saved." As she fell asleep in Marcus's arms, Sarah dreamed not of the family she was losing, but of the family she was choosing. People who saw her clearly, valued her strength, and loved her not, despite her struggles, but because of the wisdom they'd taught her. Tomorrow, the war would end, and regardless of who won, Sarah would finally be free. Sarah woke to the sound of Marcus's phone buzzing insistently at 6:30 in the morning. The caller ID showed Tyler's name, and when Marcus answered, the teenager's voice was tight with urgency. "She knows," Tyler said without preamble. "She figured out I'm not at home and she's losing it. Dad and I are in the hotel lobby with Aunt Diane. We need to move now before Mom does something desperate." Sarah was already reaching for her clothes. "What kind of desperate?" "She called Dad's cell at 5 this morning, screaming about kidnapping and parental alienation. She's threatening to call the police and report me as missing. And she's been calling Grandma and Grandpa's room every 10 minutes since dawn, telling them that you and I have been plotting against the family." Marcus was already dressed, his expression grim. "We'll be down in 5 minutes." The hotel lobby felt like a war room when they arrived. Tyler sat beside a man who was clearly his father, tall, lean, with the same intelligent eyes but an air of barely controlled fury. Across from them sat a woman in her 60s with silver hair, sharp blue eyes, and the kind of presence that commanded attention without effort. This had to be Aunt Diane. She looked up as Sarah approached, her gaze assessing and direct. "So, you're the niece who supposedly abandoned her family." Her voice was dry, sardonic. "Funny, because the Sarah I remember was the one who used to call me every Christmas and birthday, right up until about 2 years ago." Sarah felt a rush of validation so strong it was almost dizzying. "You remember the calls?" "Of course I remember them. I also remember the last one, when you were crying about how Claire had convinced your parents that you were trying to interfere in her divorce. You were devastated because you'd only suggested family therapy to help Tyler, and somehow that got twisted into you attacking Claire's parenting." Tyler's father, David, Sarah recalled, leaned forward. "Diane's been filling me in on family dynamics I was too close to see during my marriage. Apparently, Claire's manipulation patterns go back decades." 20 years at least," Diane said, crisply. "I watched her systematically undermine Sarah throughout their childhood and adolescence. Sarah would accomplish something, make honor roll, win an art contest, get accepted to college, and within days, Claire would find ways to diminish it. She was a master at making Sarah's achievements seem smaller while making her own appear more significant." Sarah sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the relief of having someone remember the truth. "I thought I was going crazy. Last night, she made it sound like my memories were delusions. Like my breakdown proved I couldn't trust my own perceptions." "Your breakdown," Diane said, her voice sharp with anger, "happened because you finally recognized what you'd been living with your entire life. Any therapist worth their degree would tell you that trauma responses often manifest when survivors finally feel safe enough to process what they've endured." David pulled out a thick folder. "I brought everything. Recordings Claire made during our marriage where she practiced manipulating family members, financial records showing how she isolated me from our joint accounts, documentation of how she convinced Tyler that my mental health was deteriorating when I started questioning her behavior. She did the same thing to me that she's doing to Mom and Dad now," Tyler added quietly. "Made Dad look unstable and forgetful so everyone would think he was the problem in their marriage." Sarah looked around the group. Tyler, who had risked everything to document the truth. David, who had survived his own campaign of psychological abuse. Diane, who had watched Claire's manipulation for decades and finally had the evidence to act on it. For the first time since arriving home, she felt like she had an army. "What's the plan?" she asked. Diane's smile was sharp as a blade. "We're going to do something Claire has never had to face. We're going to confront her with witnesses she can't manipulate, evidence she can't dismiss, and consequences she can't charm her way out of." David checked his watch. "My lawyer is driving up from Baltimore. He should be here within the hour. Adult Protective Services has been contacted about the financial abuse, and I've filed an emergency motion to modify Tyler's custody arrangement based on evidence of psychological manipulation." "But first," Diane said, standing with the authority of someone used to taking charge, "we're going to have Thanksgiving. Dinner. All of us. At my brother's house, whether Claire likes it or not." The drive to the Morrison house felt like approaching a battlefield. Sarah rode with Marcus, following David's car and Diane's rental. Her hands shook slightly as they turned onto Maple Street, but her mind felt clearer than it had since arriving home. Claire was watching from the front window when they pulled up. Even from a distance, Sarah could see the moment of shock when she realized who was getting out of the cars. Tyler, who she'd expected to be safely under her control. David, whose presence she hadn't anticipated. And Diane, arriving hours earlier than expected with backup Claire couldn't have prepared for. The front door opened before they reached the porch. Claire stood framed in the doorway, perfectly dressed in a cream-colored sweater that made her look vulnerable and innocent. But Sarah could see the calculation in her eyes, the rapid mental adjustment as she processed this unexpected development. "Tyler!" Claire's voice was pitched perfectly, relief mixed with hurt, love mixed with concern. "Thank God you're safe. I was so worried when you didn't come home last night." "I was fine, Mom," Tyler said, his voice steady. "I was with Dad." Claire's gaze shifted to David, her expression cycling through surprise, hurt, and what might have been fear before settling on wounded confusion. "David, I didn't expect to see you here. I thought we agreed that Tyler would spend Thanksgiving with my family this year." "Plans change," David said mildly, but Sarah could hear the steel underneath, especially when new information comes to light. "Diane!" Claire turned to her aunt with what appeared to be genuine pleasure. "You're early. We weren't expecting you until this afternoon." "I'm full of surprises," Diane replied dryly, stepping past Claire into the house without invitation. "Where are Bob and Linda? I have some things I'd like to discuss with them." Sarah watched Claire's face as she processed the implications of Diane's tone. For just a moment, the mask slipped entirely, revealing something cold and calculating. Then it snapped back into place, but not quickly enough. "Of course," Claire said, her voice bright with forced warmth. "They're in the kitchen starting dinner preparations. I'm sure they'll be thrilled to see everyone." The kitchen felt smaller with 7 people crowded into it. Linda stood at the counter, her face puffy from crying, while Bob sat at the table with his coffee, looking like he'd aged another decade overnight. They both looked up as the group entered, their expressions cycling through confusion, hope, and fear. "Diane!" Linda's voice broke slightly. "Oh, thank goodness you're here. Everything's been so complicated." "I imagine it has," Diane said, her tone gentle but firm. She moved to hug her sister-in-law, then her brother. "Why don't we all sit down? I think we need to have a family meeting." Claire moved smoothly to maintain control of the situation. "Of course, but maybe we should wait until Sarah is feeling more stable. Last night was very difficult for everyone, and I'm concerned about overwhelming her." "I'm not overwhelmed," Sarah said clearly. "I'm ready to have this conversation." "But sweetheart," Linda said nervously, "after what Claire told us about your phone call that night about the paranoid thoughts you were having." "What exactly did Claire tell you?" Diane's voice was sharp. Claire jumped in before Linda could answer. "I shared my concerns about Sarah's mental health based on some very frightening conversations we've had. I'm worried that she's experiencing some of the same paranoid ideation that led to her breakdown." Paranoid ideation, Diane repeated, her tone flat. That's an interesting diagnosis. What medical degree qualifies you to make it? I'm not making a diagnosis, Claire said quickly. I'm just sharing my observations as someone who loves Sarah and wants what's best for her. Then let's talk about observations, David said, pulling out his phone. I have some recorded observations of my own. Claire's face went pale. David, whatever you think you have. Audio recordings of you practicing scripts for family conversations. Financial records showing systematic theft from elderly family members. Documentation of deliberate medication tampering designed to make someone question their own mental capacity. David's voice was calm, professional. Should I continue? The silence in the kitchen was deafening. Linda looked between Claire and David with growing horror. Bob's coffee cup trembled in his hands. Claire's composed mask was cracking visibly, revealing something desperate underneath. You're taking things out of context, Claire said, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. David is still angry about our divorce. He's manipulating evidence to make me look like a sociopath? Tyler's voice cut through his mother's explanation. Because that's what the recordings sound like, Mom. You talking about people like they're chess pieces you can move around. Claire whirled toward her son, her mask slipping further. Tyler, you're 17 years old. You don't understand the complexities of adult relationships. I understand enough to know that you've been stealing from Grandma and Grandpa, Tyler said steadily. I understand that you've been making Grandpa think he's losing his memory by hiding his medications. And I understand that you planned Aunt Sarah's emotional breakdown from the moment you knew she was coming home. That's ridiculous, Claire said, but her voice was rising, the careful control beginning to fray. You're all ganging up on me, taking the word of a mentally unstable woman and a bitter ex-husband over someone who's been nothing but devoted to this family. Devoted. Diane's voice was like ice. Is that what you call stealing $300 a month from your elderly parents? Devoted is convincing your father that his memory is failing so you can control his decisions? Devoted is using your sister's mental health crisis as a weapon to discredit her? Sarah watched her family as the truth unfolded around them. Linda looked like she was in physical pain. Her hands pressed to her mouth as she processed the implications of what she was hearing. Bob's face was gray with shock and what might have been recognition. And Claire. Claire was transforming. Before their eyes. The careful composure, the strategic vulnerability, the manufactured warmth. All of it was falling away to reveal something cold and furious underneath. This is exactly what I was afraid of, Claire said, her voice turning hard. Sarah comes home with her victim complex and her conspiracy theories, and now she's turned everyone against me, even my own son. I turned myself against you, Tyler said quietly. When I realized that everything you taught me about love and family was actually about control and manipulation. Claire's laugh was bitter, ugly. You're 17 years old. You have no idea what sacrifice looks like, what it means to hold a family together when everyone else is falling apart. You didn't hold anything together, Sarah said, finding her voice. You systematically destroyed anyone who threatened your control. You made me question my own sanity, because I was the only one who saw what you were really doing. What I was really doing. Claire's voice was venomous now, all pretense abandoned. I was protecting this family from your chaos. I was making sure Mom and Dad had stability instead of having to constantly worry about their unstable daughter. I was giving Tyler a mother who could actually function instead of one who calls in the middle of the night talking about conspiracies. You were isolating and abusing vulnerable people, David said firmly. And it's going to stop. Claire looked around the room, seeing her carefully constructed kingdom crumbling around her. When she spoke again, her voice was different, colder, more calculating than Sarah had ever heard it. You think you've won something here, she said, her gaze moving from person to person. You think exposing me means you get to feel better about yourselves. But you have no idea what you've just destroyed. She looked directly at Sarah. And for the first time, Sarah saw her sister's true face. Not the golden child, not the perfect daughter, but someone who saw people as objects, to be controlled and discarded when they stopped being useful. I protected them from you, Claire said simply. And now they're going to have to deal with the reality of who you really are. Someone so broken that she can't exist in the world without destroying everyone around her. The words were designed to wound, to plant seeds of doubt that would grow long after this confrontation ended. But Sarah felt nothing but clarity as she looked at her sister. The only thing you protected them from, Sarah said quietly, was the truth about who you are. Claire's face contorted with rage, and for a moment Sarah thought she might physically attack. But then Linda spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Get out." Everyone turned to look at her. Linda Morrison, who had avoided conflict her entire life, who had enabled dysfunction rather than face difficult truths, was looking at her older daughter with an expression of profound sadness and newfound clarity. "Get out of my house," Linda said, her voice growing stronger. "I need you to leave, now." Claire stared at her mother in shock. "Mom, you don't understand what you're saying. You need me. Who's going to take care of you? Who's going to handle the bills, the appointments, all the things you can't manage on your own?" "We'll figure it out," Bob said, his voice hoarse but determined. "We managed for 60 years before you moved back in. We can manage again." "This is a mistake," Claire said, desperation creeping into her voice for the first time. "You're making a terrible mistake. Sarah will disappoint you again. She always does. And when she falls apart, when she has another breakdown, you'll wish you'd listen to me." "Maybe," Linda said sadly. "But at least we'll be making our own mistakes instead of living with yours." Claire looked around the room one final time, searching for any ally, any crack in the united front against her. Finding none, she straightened her shoulders and walked toward the door with as much dignity as she could muster. At the threshold, she turned back. "Tyler, you're coming with me." "No," Tyler said simply. "I'm staying with Dad." The finality in his voice seemed to break something in Claire. For just a moment she looked genuinely hurt, genuinely lost. Then the mask snapped back into place one final time. "Fine," she said coldly. "But don't come crying to me when this all falls apart. Don't expect me to clean up the mess when Sarah destroys everything again." The front door closed behind her with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than a slam. In the silence that followed, Linda began to cry. Not the desperate sobs of the past few days, but the cleansing tears of someone finally free to grieve what she'd lost and begin healing from what she'd endured. Sarah felt no triumph, no satisfaction in Claire's exile. Only sadness for the family that had been fractured, and hope for the family that might still be saved. The aftermath of Claire's departure felt like the moments following a car accident. Shocking silence, the slow inventory of damage, the gradual recognition that survival was possible. Linda sat at the kitchen table, tissues scattered around, her like evidence of a battle fought and won at enormous cost. Bob moved mechanically through the motions of making fresh coffee, his hands shaking slightly as he measured grounds. Tyler stood by the window, watching the street as if expecting his mother to return at any moment. Sarah felt suspended between grief and relief, mourning the sister she'd thought she'd had while celebrating the freedom from manipulation she'd never imagined possible. Marcus stayed close beside her, a steady presence anchoring her to reality, as her family began the difficult process of untangling decades of lies. "I need to understand," Linda said finally, her voice hoarse from crying. "How long has this been going on? How did I miss it?" Diane sat down across from her sister-in-law, her expression gentle but unflinching. "Linda, you didn't miss it. You saw it. But Claire trained you not to trust what you were seeing. That's how manipulation works. It makes you doubt your own perceptions until you become dependent on the manipulator to tell you what's real." "But the signs must have been there," Bob said, setting down coffee cups with careful precision. "I should have seen. I should have protected." "You were being manipulated too," David said firmly. "Claire's gift is making people feel responsible for her actions while taking credit for their successes. She made Sarah feel responsible for family conflict while taking credit for family harmony. She made you feel responsible for her emotional state while taking credit for managing the household." Tyler turned from the window, his young face etched with pain and wisdom beyond his years. "She's been doing it to me my whole life. making me feel like I was responsible for her happiness after the divorce, like I had to protect her from anyone who might misunderstand her. I thought being a good son meant never questioning her version of events. Sarah felt her heart break for this remarkable teenager who'd had to grow up too fast, who'd been forced to choose between loyalty and truth at an age when he should have been worried about homework and friends. Tyler, none of this is your fault. You were the child in the relationship. The responsibility was hers, not yours. I know that now, Tyler said quietly, but it's hard to unlearn 17 years of training. David moved to stand beside his son, their resemblance clear in profile. It took me 3 years of therapy after our divorce to fully understand what Claire had done to my sense of reality. Even now, sometimes I catch myself questioning my own memories of events because she was so effective at making me doubt them. The magnitude of the damage was staggering. 3 generations of family members, all systematically trained to distrust their own perceptions, to defer to Claire's version of reality, to take responsibility for her emotions while giving her credit for their achievements. Sarah wondered how many other families lived with similar dynamics. How many people walked through the world doubting their own sanity, because someone they trusted had taught them that their perceptions couldn't be trusted. What happens now? Linda asked, looking around the room with eyes that seemed to be seeing clearly for the first time in years. How do we heal from this? Slowly, Diane said honestly. With professional help. With patience. For yourselves and each other. With the understanding that undoing this kind of damage takes time. Marcus spoke for the first time since Claire's departure. In my experience working with families in crisis, the first step is usually the hardest. You've taken that step by choosing truth over comfort. Everything else is just work. Work I'm not sure I'm capable of, Bob said heavily. I feel like I don't know anything anymore. How do I trust my own judgment when I was so completely fooled? You weren't fooled, Sarah said gently. You were betrayed by someone you loved and trusted. There's a difference. Fool suggests you should have known better. Betrayed acknowledges that Claire exploited your love for her own purposes. Sarah thought about her own journey from breakdown to clarity, the months of therapy that had taught her to distinguish between her trauma responses and her authentic perceptions. Dad, you'll learn to trust yourself again. It takes time and support, but it's possible. I'm proof of that. Tyler's phone buzzed and he glanced at it with a frown. It's Mom. She's texting that she's coming back to get her things. The mood in the room immediately tensed. David checked his watch. My lawyer should be here soon. We need to be strategic about this. Claire's dangerous when she feels cornered, and right now she's lost everything. Her control over the family, her living situation, probably her access to your parents' finances. What kind of dangerous? Linda asked nervously. The kind that burns bridges to make sure no one else can cross them, Diane said grimly. If Claire can't have control of this family, she'll try to destroy what's left of it rather than let anyone else have peace. As if summoned by their conversation, a car pulled into the driveway. But it wasn't Claire's sedan. It was a black SUV with government plates. 2 people got out, a middle-aged woman in a professional suit and a younger man carrying a briefcase. Adult Protective Services, David said, relief evident in his voice. They're here about the financial abuse allegations. The next hour felt like a whirlwind of official questions, document reviews, and formal statements. The APS investigator, a woman named Janet Walsh, was thorough and professional, asking detailed questions about the timeline of Claire's financial control, the methods she'd used to isolate Bob and Linda from their own decision-making, and the evidence Tyler and David had gathered. Based on what you've shown me, Walsh said finally, we have grounds to freeze the accounts in question and investigate potential criminal charges. Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, you'll need to come to our office next week to formally revoke any financial power of attorney documents your daughter may have convinced you to sign. We never signed any power of attorney, Bob said, confused. Walsh and David exchanged glances. Sir, according to our records, financial power of attorney documents for both you and your wife were filed with the county clerk's office last Tuesday. The silence was deafening. Linda's face went white. That's impossible. We never... Claire mentioned it, but we never actually... She forged them, Tyler said flatly. She had us all meet with her lawyer last month, supposedly to discuss emergency planning. She must have forged signatures on documents we never actually saw. The scope of Claire's deception was breathtaking. Not content with manipulation and theft, she'd moved into outright fraud, legally positioning herself to control her parents' lives completely. Walsh was making notes rapidly. This constitutes identity theft and fraud in addition to the financial abuse. We'll need to coordinate with local police on the criminal investigation. Another car pulled into the driveway, David's lawyer arriving from Baltimore. But as he got out of his car, Claire's sedan appeared at the end of the street, moving slowly as if she were assessing the situation before committing to approach. She's back, Tyler said, his voice tight with anxiety. Sarah watched through the window as Claire parked across the street, clearly debating her next move. Even from a distance, Sarah could see the calculation in her sister's posture, the way she seemed to be weighing options and consequences. David's lawyer, a sharp-eyed man named Robert Chen, quickly briefed himself on the situation while keeping one eye on Claire's car. If she approaches the house, no one engages with her directly. Everything goes through me. We don't want to give her any opportunity to manipulate the situation or claim harassment. As if she'd heard him, Claire got out of her car and began walking toward the house. But her demeanor was different, less controlled, more erratic. Her usually perfect appearance was disheveled, her movements sharp and unpredictable. The doorbell rang, followed immediately by aggressive knocking. "Let me in!" Claire's voice carried through the door, higher pitched than usual. "I need to get my things. You can't keep me out of my own family's house." Chen positioned himself near the door. "Mrs. Morrison, this property belongs to your parents. They have the right to deny you access. If you need to retrieve personal belongings, we can arrange a supervised visit through proper legal channels." "Legal channels?" Claire's laugh was shrill. "You're going to use lawyers against me? I'm their daughter. I've been taking care of them for 2 years while St. Sarah was off playing victim in Colorado." Sarah felt the familiar twist of guilt and shame at Claire's words, but this time it was overlaid with clarity. She recognized the technique, the emotional manipulation designed to make her feel responsible for Claire's behavior, the attempt to reframe abuse as care and self-protection, as betrayal. "Claire," Sarah called through the door, "you can get your belongings, but you need to do it through proper channels. What you've done here, the theft, the forgery, the manipulation, it has to stop." "What I've done." Claire's voice cracked with hysteria. "What about what you've done? You've destroyed this family. You've turned everyone against me with your paranoid delusions and your victim complex." Tyler moved closer to the door, his face pale but determined. "Mom, I'm the one who documented everything. I'm the one who called Dad." Sarah didn't turn. "Me against you. You did that yourself." The silence from the other side of the door stretched so long that Sarah wondered if Claire had left. Then her voice came again, lower, more dangerous. "Tyler, you have no idea what you've done. You think you're protecting people, but you're destroying the only stability this family has ever had. When everything falls apart, and it will, remember that you chose this." "I chose truth," Tyler said simply, "and I'd choose it again." Another long silence, then the sound of footsteps moving away from the door, getting into a car, driving away. Walsh finished gathering her initial information and prepared to leave, promising to return the next day with additional documentation and support resources. Chen reviewed the legal options available to Bob and Linda, outlining the steps needed to protect their assets and prevent further fraud. As the officials departed, the Morrison house felt strangely empty despite being filled with people. The absence of Claire's controlling presence left a vacuum that no one quite knew how to fill. "What do we do now?" Linda asked, the question Sarah suspected they were all thinking. "We learn how to be a family without someone controlling the narrative," Diane said. "We figure out who we actually are when we're not performing for someone else's approval." Sarah looked around the kitchen, at her parents, vulnerable but finally free to make their own choices. At Tyler, wise beyond his years but finally able to be 17. At Marcus, whose love had given her the strength to fight for truth. At Diane, whose refusal to enable dysfunction had helped save them all. We start with honesty, Sarah said. About what happened, about what we need, about who we want to become. And we do it together, as people who choose to love each other, rather than people who are obligated to by blood. As the afternoon sun slanted through the kitchen windows, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since childhood, the sense of being truly home. Not in the house where she'd grown up, but in the presence of people who saw her clearly and valued her anyway. The battle for her family's reality was over. The work of healing could finally begin. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories, right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.